So this presentation by the National Association of Invasive Plant Councils for the National Invasive Species Awareness Week, our first webinar today, Monday, is by Dr. Stephen Enlow. He is an Associate Professor, Agronomy Department, Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants, University of Florida. Dr. Enlow has been involved with invasive plant research and extension for the past 19 years. He's worked throughout the western and southeastern United States, including California, Colorado, Wyoming, Alabama, and now Florida. So over the last 8 years, he's worked extensively on Kogon grass, Chinese privet, Chinese tallow tree, Japanese climbing fern, Chinaberry tree, and a host of other invasive plants. He has also recently worked in the area of bioenergy with an emphasis on preventing potential bioenergy species from becoming the next big invader. And as if he doesn't have enough to do with all of that, he is also the Southeast EPSI president. And I will now turn the time over to Dr. Enlow.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
All right, excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to NISAW, the first webinar of the week. It's great to be here with you. I am been looking forward to this seminar for quite some time. That was not my phone. Are we good? Okay, so what we're going to do today is talk about hack and squirt as an invasive plant treatment. And I just couldn't resist the idea of putting Jason from Hollywood there on the first screen with his machete and personal protective equipment. Looks like he's about ready to go for hack and squirt. Okay, so I'm going to move forward here. Hack and squirt comes across as a very simple idea regarding woody invasive plant control. We think about taking a sharpened tool like a hatchet and making a hack into the tree and immediately following that up with a squirt of a concentrated herbicide solution. Thus the name hack and squirt. Why I like hack and squirt over other types of IPT treatments like cut stump, it's a whole lot less messy in terms of applicator issues and ability to navigate through a site where you're actively working. When we get into big time cut stump type treatments for large trees, the site's pretty messy there for a long time. Hack and squirt IPT is really an excellent approach where dead standing trees are acceptable. This is very important, and so if you're working in urban areas along roadsides, rights of ways where there's a lot of active traffic or people, hack and squirt may not be the best option because typically the hack and squirt results in trees that slowly die, but they can be subject to wind throw and they can drop limbs over time. So you don't want people picnicking under these trees. Hack and squirt is also very selective and can provide very selective control even with non-selective herbicides. The techniques of hack and squirt are relatively simple and they are easy to teach crews. There's minimal herbicide exposure for applicators. That doesn't mean we throw our personal protective equipment out. We are working with concentrated herbicides typically for hack and squirt, but in general much less exposure than you would typically get from backpack foliar applications. And hack and squirt can actually be a little bit fun. So it's enjoyable to take and a machete or a hatchet and go after a tree and know that that thing is going to die. Now, the reality is there's several terms out there. Hack and squirt, incision point application, frill treatments, girdle treatments, injection. Are these terms interchangeable? And the answer is not exactly. And what you will find in conversations with people from across the country is they will often say hack and squirt, but what they might actually mean is some variation in hack and squirt, such as a girdle type treatment or even injection. So it's very important when you're having conversations about these types of techniques that you really get clarity on exactly what people are doing, because these terms are not completely interchangeable, but people in conversation often do use them interchangeably somewhat. So my outline for today's discussion will go as such. We're going to talk about targets, we're going to talk about the tools, the terminology, as we've just mentioned before, the methods actually utilized, the herbicides that we use for hack and squirt, and herbicide flashback, which can be an issue in some cases for hack and squirt type treatment. So what is our target tree size? Typically we like to say just about anything 2 inches in diameter or breast height or greater we can do hack and squirt on. And an easier way to say that is anything that's too big for basal bark treatment is really where hack and squirt fits in. We often use basal bark treatment on trees 4 inches in diameter, sometimes even 6 to 8 inches in diameter for certain species, but in general we typically hack and squirt comes in when trees get too big for basal bark. Basal bark is a very efficient way of treating a lot of trees, especially small stem trees, 1 to 2 inches in diameter in a lot of cases. And so when we try to do hack and squirt on things less than 2 inches in diameter, we often hack too deeply and literally make a cut stump. So we literally take the whole tree down. This is Norway maple, and you can see a diversity of size classes there, all the way to from 10-inch diameter trees there on the right, down to some very small diameter trees that might be a little more difficult with hack and squirt. So we're typically looking at trees from about this size, this size, this size, this size, and so forth like that when we're using hack and squirt type techniques. Now, there is no real maximum size for hack and squirt type treatments. This is out in Hawaii, giant albizia trees, the genus Falcataria. And here you can see a tree several feet in diameter or breast height. And you can see the incision hacks that are made around that tree where herbicide is applied into each of those. And they successfully and very effectively control these giant albizia trees in Hawaii with hack and squirt methodology. So, there is a reality with hack and squirt. It is often easiest done on generally single stem or limited number of stemmed species, so that when you have multi-stem shrubs and trees, this is Brazilian pepper tree from South Florida, it becomes much more difficult to employ the methods of hack and squirt on these types of snarls with a 14 or 15 stems coming off of it. So single stem trees, much more easy in terms of application of hack and squirt techniques. So let's look at some tree anatomy quickly in the target area of hack and squirt. So we've got a couple of, we've got a transverse section here of a woody stem on the top section, and here we have a tangential longitudinal section which shows us the outer bark, the inner bark, the phloem here, moving on to the cambium tissue, and then the sapwood, which is the xylem where water nutrients are transported. Within that, we get into the heartwood, which is definitely dead. Let's blow that up just a little bit. When we think about hack and squirt, the target area specifically on this tangential section here, what you can see is making an incision that goes through the outer bark, that actually penetrates the inner bark of the phloem. We get to that for sure. It hits the cambium and usually terminates in the shallow sapwood. And that's typically what we're recommending that people do when they make an incision into the tree, or a hack as we call it, that they actually reach the white sapwood just inside the cambium. If we think about girdle type treatments where we're completely removing a band of tissue around that tree, in this case you can see that we are going through the bark, through the phloem, through the cambium, all the way to the sapwood. And typically a either narrow band that could be just an inch wide up to 4 to 6 inches in some cases. Now if we go back in history, people have been girdling trees for a long, long time. Probably observed goats had the ability to girdle and kill trees from thousands of years ago, and recognized that if they were to remove that strip of bark around the tree, they could eventually cause a lot of different trees to starve, and the leaves would fall off and the tree would die. For some species, indeed, there would be a lot of resprouting at the base and from lateral roots, but in general, they realized that they could really suppress and take out a lot of different woody species simply using a girdle method. In the early 1900s, there was a lot of research efforts that were initiated looking at different chemicals that could be applied into those hacks and girdles to get more effective kill of the trees. And so back in the 1920s, ammonium sulfamate and sodium arsenite were two chemicals that were widely utilized for removal of non-desirable woody plants. And basically you can see that the picture on the left, they would often take an axe and make cups at the base, or they would girdle around the tree and literally pour those chemicals directly into that girdled area. Now, let's make no mistake about it. Hack and squirt has been developed over time since then with forestry in mind. It's typically been all about selective removal of undesirable hardwoods. So whether you're working in any type of conifers or you are working in hardwood silviculture, there's always a need to thin out and remove undesirable, unwanted hardwood trees. And that is where the history of hack and squirt evolved, from trying to go into hardwood stands and selectively remove those that they did not want. The idea of using hack and squirt for invasive plants is a much more recent concept that was just embraced and evolved from hack and squirt within the area of silvicultural forestry. The tools of hack and squirt are very straightforward historically. An axe, like you see there on the left, was utilized. Now much more commonly, please forgive me if I cough a little bit. I've had a bit of a mess in terms of my sinuses and health here lately, but I'll persevere and get through this the best I can without coughing. So the basic tools, simple hatchet on the right, and that is very widely utilized today. Now, in addition to hatchets that you see there on the left of this picture, there's also a number of different types of other cutting blades that have been utilized for hack and squirt type treatments. So there's a wide range of machetes that are actually out there on the market and available. I can't even name them all. But you can see varying from a typically bush machete with a longer blade to something like a cane knife to a bolo machete. And you can find these types of short-handled machetes that are out there. But in my experience, they typically don't quite have enough weight to really do what you want to do easily or effectively. The reality is, whatever kind of tool you're using for hack and squirt, it's very important to keep it sharp. So if you're going out to a hardware store and buying tools, whether machetes, hatchets, you need to go ahead and sharpen them before you take them to the field. That's very important because using a dull machete or a dull hatchet out operationally is not only difficult and exhausting, it also can become dangerous. As you can't get good clean cuts, you may have more glancing blows that can lead to applicator injury. So whatever the tool you use, keep it sharp indeed. But not that sharp. There's absolutely no reason to make them razor sharp so that you might be able to shave with it. We are cutting through wood. We are not cutting the hair off your face. So I know this is a ridiculous picture, but the point is, you don't have to make them razor sharp so that they will split hairs and cut paper, but you do want to pay attention and keep your instruments sharp. Additionally, some folks have utilized cordless drills. Excuse me. Cordless drills, basically using something between about a 3/8 to a 5/16 inch bit, and typically about 18 volts. Are pretty good. It's good to have a few extra batteries handy that are fully charged. You can run these batteries down pretty quickly, drilling in to the wood. The depth on these is often a little tricky because you're typically wanting to make those cuts about a 1/2 inch to 1.5 inches through the bark to the sapwood, and the bark thickness can really depend upon how deep that actually goes. So if you're trying to use drills for a very diverse set of trees and age classes and diameter classes, you can have difficulty in getting consistency on the depth of your hacks. One thing that's very important is that you don't drill too deep. There's absolutely no reason to be drilling deep down to the heartwood. There is nothing going on in the heartwood. I hear people talking about taking and drilling all the way to the center of the tree, and it's a waste of time because it is not where the herbicides will be translocated. Additionally, a chainsaw is often utilized for girdling trees in terms of girdle treatments. This is something that's a little more tricky. You're typically wanting to cut about a 1.5 inch band around the base, around the tree, and the depth on that you can get pretty wild with a chainsaw if you're not careful. And it's often very fatiguing in terms of holding it consistent and doing this on a large number of trees in a day. Another historic injection tool that a lot of foresters will be familiar with, but the invasive plant world may not, is called a jim. Basically, this was an instrument that was developed. What we have here is a herbicide reservoir within the tube. We have a sharpened cutting blade, and then we have a plunger which opens the valve, releasing the herbicide, and then a handle to release it. So you would thrust this at the base of the tree, getting a good clean cut here with the blade, and then release the handle and inject the herbicide directly into each individual cut. These things, as far as I can tell, are no longer made and not for sale retail-wise, but I suspect there's probably still quite a few of them out there within the forestry world that might be available. There's modern injection, much more recent and utilized now, the hypo hatchet tree injector, which is basically a hatchet which has the ability, a hollow point there that allows herbicide to be injected directly into the cuts upon impact of the herbicide through the bark. In addition, there is another injection system called the EasyJect Lance system, which is basically a long tube loaded up with gel-filled herbicide shells, and as you thrust those into the base of the tree, the herbicide is released slowly over time, providing for a long, slow kill. So the reality is, for most hack and squirt, the most commonly used tools come down to a hatchet with a slightly curved blade there that forms a good cup, and a bush machete. Now what you'll see here is some data that I collected from Florida and from Southeast Exotic Pest Plant Council meeting in Chapel Hill, North Carolina last year, where we surveyed about 150 separate applicators for the tools they were using. What you will see about Florida is it's very different from most of the Southeast in the proportion of folks using machetes is much, much greater. The further south you go, the softer the tropical, the tropical, subtropical hardwoods get. Machetes are much easier and more useful in terms of operational use. As you get across most of the Southeast, you'll see that hatchets are the #1 tool that are utilized. Very few people using cane knives, hypo hatchets, EasyJects. Limited chainsaw work more in Florida than across the Southeast. Other tools there, typically drills, would be what we're talking about there. So you can see Florida definitely stands out as different from the rest of the Southeast there between the machete and the hatchet. So what applicator do you use when you inject that or spray that herbicide into the cuts? Well, there is a ton of different spray bottles on the market. And if you were to go to one of the box stores, the hardware stores, typically what you're going to see is the Spraymaster, which is a chemically resistant sprayer, the ZEP Professional Sprayer, which is another chemically resistant sprayer, and then you'll have a lot more generics, bottles of all sorts, shapes and sizes, like the HCX sprayer, and then you can go and find a lot of what are called plant care sprayers. And these things are typically not chemically resistant. All of these things can be effective and can be utilized for the purposes of hack and squirt. However, do you know how much material each of these bottles is putting out on a given stroke or pump of the handle? It's a great question, and we did take a look into that. And what we found was among these three bottles here, the Spraymaster on the right, a single stroke puts out about 3.14 mils of solution, where the ZEP was about 2.78 mils, and one of the generic bottles, I think this might have been from Lowe's generic, 1.26 mils. So this is kind of interesting because typically when we do hack and squirt, we often fill the cup that we create with our tool, and herbicide runs out the sides of that cup. And we think we're applying a half mil to a mil of solution, but the reality is if you're using a Spraymaster, you may be putting over 3 mils, which could be anywhere from a 3 to 6x increase over what the herbicide label actually recommends. Now, additionally, beyond those types of squirt bottles, there's several different systems out there. There's a rigid backpack that you can get and basically use a veterinary type syringe as your applicator. So these vet syringes are handheld, squeezable, and they are adjustable in terms of the volume of solution that you can deliver with each stroke. In this case, this one goes anywhere from 1/2 mil all the way up to about 2.5 mils, but they make them of many different sizes. You can use something like a 16 gauge needle, a lure lock syringe on the end of these things. What I found is that does tend to increase the pressure, and the herbicide squirts out pretty hard, so you can really blast it into the cut and actually get some flying out. So it's not necessary to put the needles on there in most cases, and I don't typically recommend it, but these types of systems are extremely effective in terms of dedicated hack and squirt backpack type work. In addition, I have seen people take soft bladder backpacks like the Camelbacks and use the veterinary syringe with those as the applicator. It's pretty easy to take and build one of these yourself and just install the syringe or the applicator onto the backpack. What I've learned or using and testing soft bladders is when you're working in very thick brush or around blackberries or around thorny species like locust, like robinia, it's very easy to puncture that backpack, that bladder, and so you can really set yourself back as you're navigating through terrain. So you need to be very careful about that if you happen to be using one of these. Plus, if you're using a Camelback, it's pretty much dedicated for herbicide use from there on and should be labeled thereas. Now, let's get into the methods. We've talked about the tools, the applicator bottles. So when it gets down to the nut and bolts of how this actually works, there's several different methods that you will often see described on herbicide labels and recommendation guides for invasive plant control. The first is continuous or overlapping type hacks, and what you can see here is a good clean hatchet hack, and here's the next one, and you can see that there's overlap between those so that they are forming a continuous series of hacks, and you can see this one overlaps it a little bit even more deeply, and then over here you can see another one that's lined up right here to make that continuous type cut. So this is called continuous or overlapping type hacks, and you'll often see that terminology on specific herbicide labels. The next is evenly spaced hacks, and here what you can see is we have a hack and we have some space between that and the next hack, and typically it's recommended that these are sort of spaced excuse me, evenly around the trees so that you very clearly have a uniform spacings of hacks all the way around the circumference of each individual stem. Now, Dr. James Leary at the University of Hawaii has taken this evenly spaced hacks a step further and has developed some new terminology, what he calls incision point application, which is actually even wider spaced hacks that may be even 12 inches in between individual hacks for specific herbicide treatments on specific species. And so this is a good publication he's written on the use of incision point application technique for woody invasive plant species. By the way, I will make this slide set available to anybody who wants it. All you have to do is send me an email and request it, and I will share you a link to it so that you can get all of these things if you don't have time to write it down. Next would be a frill cut and treat, and in this case you're literally creating a frill where you make a hack and the bark kind of peels back all the way around the tree, and then you would take and make your application just inside that frill where the bark is still attached and will hold the herbicide very nicely. And finally, the girdle and treat method. This is something done in South Florida for Melaleuca type treatments, and what you can see here is Melaleuca has an extremely thick bark, and so this tree is girdled all the way down to the sapwood, and then our herbicide solution is sprayed all the way around the girdle. Now anytime you're doing continuous frills or doing girdle type treatments, it is very important that you thoroughly wet that cut surface all the way around the circumference of the tree, because if you think about what you're doing with the girdle, you are immediately disrupting all photosynthate flow from the canopy of that tree down to the crown and the base of the root crown and the roots, and it's extremely disruptive to do that. And oftentimes we find if you do not get really good coverage with the herbicide treatment you're using on a girdle, you'll get a lot of resprouting at the base. And girdling is not even recommended for a lot of woody invasives. It tends to make them angry, and we just don't get very good control with girdling. Now, the other reality of girdling is it's a huge amount of work. The whole idea with hack and squirt, in my mind, is the simplicity of it. And if you are finding that you're having to go to these lengths in order to get very effective control, I would encourage you to step back and ask, is there other ways that this can be done that doesn't require this much work? This is Chinese tallow tree that was girdled, and a girdle like this with a machete would literally take about 10 to 15 minutes per individual. Tremendous amount of work. And I like to avoid that where possible. This is what I like to call ridiculous overkill, and here you can see a number of things that an applicator has done to kill Java plum in South Florida. But what you can see here is literally downward cuts, possibly with a machete or a chainsaw, followed by two girdles, one here and one here. And this is absolutely overkill typically in terms of what it takes to control most woody invasives. It's a lot of extra work, and I don't recommend double girdling in terms of invasive plant control in just about any situation. Okay, so in terms of the methods of injection, you got the Jim injector I mentioned before, and you can see there the nice thing is you're dropping that thing right down just above the root collar and making your incisions, delivering the herbicide directly to the base of the tree. The Easy Eject Lance system, again, these little shells are loaded with a gel-filled herbicide. It's available in glyphosate and imazapyr, and you can see the injection is made similar to a Jim. It's thrust in, the shells are injected, and you can see each of these individual shells. They're typically done on some even spacing around the tree itself. Okay, so that's reality. That's primarily the tools of injection that are widely utilized, the tools for hack and squirt, for girdling. So we've got all our tools, so we're going to go through a few other questions here. What angle should I make my cuts? When you're doing this, the whole idea is to make an angle that literally creates a well that the herbicide will be held within after you pull your blade out. And so is there an absolute optimal angle? Well, we like to say approximately 45 degrees is a pretty good angle. This is a torpedo digital level that I've placed upon the blade of that machete, and you can see that I'm making a cut at 46.7 degrees. What you will find is if you start getting shallower than that or flatter, it's a lot more work, and you'll wear yourself out trying to cut perpendicularly into a tree. And additionally, it doesn't make a good cup to hold herbicide. The steeper the angle that you make there, the machete or the hatchet is often going to be subject to glancing off of the tree itself, and that's a very hazardous thing to do because you could injure yourself severely with a glancing blow when you're trying to hack at too steep of an angle. In addition, when you're hacking at very steep angles, say up about 70 degrees or so, this is what can happen. You basically make a hack that is too steep and too shallow and does not penetrate as deep as you need it to. So when you put the herbicide in, you may have not even penetrated the entire bark layer. Well, trees are very good at sealing themselves from wounds like that. So if you put a water-soluble herbicide into a hack and you did not penetrate the bark, well, that water-soluble herbicide is not going to find its way down into the tissue because it's just unable to penetrate that tissue very well, and the tree will seal itself off, and you'll see things like this. So you can see complete failure if you're hacking too shallow. Now, is there an optimal height to do hack and squirt? So what you can see here is I'm hacking lead tree, and the machete is probably at a height of about 30 inches there. There's a couple of answers regarding optimal heights. From a physiologic standpoint, the reality is the lower the better. Anything you can do to put that herbicide closer to the target area, which is that root collar and lateral roots, the better off you're going to be. So the shorter the distance required for translocation, the better off you're going to be. So it would be fantastic if we could all run around hacking at 2 to 6 inches in height. The reality is we would kill our backs, and we would put all our applicators out of business if we forced them to do that. So from an operational standpoint, whatever height is comfortable for the applicator is just fine and typically works pretty well in terms of both these hack and squirt type operations. So you could say, depending on your height and the comfort of swinging that blade, at a downward angle about 45 degrees. 18 to 36 inches is pretty common. And so you can even go a little higher than that. Some people are up at 4 feet. But overall, you've got a pretty wide range there. So the lower you can go, the better. But operationally, what is the height that is comfortable for you to make a nice, safe downward swing with your blade is probably where you need to be. Now, when can you do hack and squirt? Seasonally. Can we do it spring? Can we do it winter, spring, summer, fall? That's what I have here. Actually, spring, summer, fall, and winter. There we go. Okay, so yes, most of the time we can do hack and squirt operationally 4 seasons out of the year. Is there an optimal season? For many species, we often say late summer into early fall is one of the absolute best times to do hack and squirt. With certain species, we can move on into the winter and get very effective control. And with a lot of things, we still can get good control in the spring. So most of the year is fine. Late summer through fall, most often effective. The one period you want to avoid typically is during heavy sap flow in the late winter and early spring. So as those trees as the buds begin to swell and you begin to see a lot of sap flow upwards, pushing out that new leaf growth, that is the one time that we do not recommend hack and squirt, because you can actually have strong enough sap flow that can push the herbicide up out of the cuts. And so that's the one time that we see very inconsistent control with hack and squirt. What about rainfall? Does rainfall really influence hack and squirt? I will say you want to avoid treating during heavy rain. Now, if you have a situation where you just treated and you had an absolute massive thunderstorm come along where you had tremendous flushing of water down the primary trunks and was flushing into the cuts, yes, some herbicide could be washed out of those. I will say in my experience, though, when you make a cut and immediately put herbicide into it, it moves very quickly into the tree. And so it's not sitting there just in a reservoir being taken up slowly. It typically gets moves into the tree very fast. So if rainfall is coming and you know about it, you're still probably going to be okay in a lot of situations, but if you get rained on during it, you can see some reduced control. Okay, this is what a lot of folks want to know. What herbicides are useful for hack and squirt? Now, if we think about agricultural research, we've tested hundreds and hundreds of herbicides for all kinds of different weed control in agricultural systems with foliar applications. However, when we get to all the way down to hack and squirt type research, that's a very limited subset of weed science herbicide research. And the reality is there are very few herbicides that are effective for hack and squirt, and we've tested very few in general. Pre-1950, ammonium sulfamate, or amate as it's called, sodium arsenite were tested, diesel kerosene, and a whole myriad of toxic heavy metal compounds and a number of other things have been utilized and tested to evaluate their effectiveness at killing trees with hack and squirt. Excuse me. Sodium arsenite is one of the most effective ever, but this stuff is extremely dangerous for applicators, and it was the sooner we could get rid of that, the better. In the 1950s and 60s, with the advent of the auxin-type herbicides, 2,4-D, 2,4,5-T were researched extensively, as was picloram. Picloram is still recommended today at 2,4-D, not so much 2,4,5-T, no longer with us. In the 70s, and it didn't work that great anyway for hack and squirt. In the 70s and the 90s, glyphosate, dicamba, triclopyr, and imazapyr were all researched extensively, primarily in forestry, and that's where they were developed. And those are the 3 leading herbicides we have now still over the last 30, 40 years for hack and squirt type research. So the reality is not a whole lot has changed. Since 2000, over the last 15 years, a few new herbicides have been tested and found to be promising for hack and squirt, including aminopyrrolate, which is milestone, aminocyclopyrrochlor, which is method, and imazamox, which is clearcast. So not a whole lot there. Now, if we go directly to what the herbicide labels actually say about hack and squirt type strategies, they're often broken out into these categories. You'll have injection, you'll have a statement regarding use of injection, a statement on hack and squirt, and a statement on frill or girdle type treatments. So Garlon 3A, which is widely utilized for hack and squirt type treatments, basically the label recommends a 1/2 mil of 100%, so basically straight herbicide right out of the jug, or 1 mil of a 50% dilution in water. Okay, so either a 1/2 mil concentrate or 1 mil 50%. You'll often see that for several herbicides too. And the recommendation is for injection 3 to 4 inches between centers. So an injector typically has a relatively narrow cut of about 2 inches. And so you can see for 4 inches between centers, you still have relatively closely spaced injection points there. For hack and squirt, again, 1/2 mil of 100% or 1 mil of 50%, with typically it's recommended overlapping cuts, making a continuous series of cuts around the circumference of the tree. If you're going frill or girdle with Garlon 3A or triclopiramine generics, basically you spray to wet that with either of those solutions, doing a full-on girdle type treatment and wetting it thoroughly. If we look at Habitat or imazapyr or other generics, Habitat is the aquatic formulation. We'll also be talking about Arsenal AC, Polaris, Chopper Gen 2 type products. Basically 1 mil of a 9% solution with 1 inch between excuse me, injection points. 1 mil of about a 66% solution per 3 inches of DBH for hack and squirt, and somewhere between a 25 to 100% spray to wet for frill or girdle. So those are recommendations for imazapyr. And if you look across imazapyr labels, you'll find that they are relatively close to this. Arsenal AC, which has a 4 pound per gallon formulation, is going to be slightly different from this. Rodeo or glyphosate. Rodeo is the aquatic formulation, but a number of glyphosate products, Accord concentrate, just tons of them out there. Basically, the recommendation is a mil of between 50 and 100% solution per every 2 to 3 inches DBH or diameter at breast height. If you look at a few of other herbicides, Milestone, which is a newer compound, which is showing a lot of promise for hack and squirt on specific species, especially leguminous species. So anything like mimosa, wild locust, honey locust, black locust, very effective. So 1 mil of a 10% solution on 3 to 4 inch centers for injection, 1 mil of a 10% overlapping if doing hack and squirt, and a 10% spray to wet the entire girdle for a frill or girdle type treatment. Transline, a little bit older herbicide, or also known as clopyralid. I'm so sorry. Basically what you see there is, again, is that 1/2 mil of 100% or 1 mil of 50% on 3 to 4 inch centers for injection. Similar recommendation for hack and squirt, and then spray to wet the entire girdle with either 50% material or 100% material. Tordon RTU, which is a ready-to-use formulation of Tordon, 1 mil of 100% with 2 to 3 inches between hack edges. Now that's different from hack centers, and exactly why they wrote the herbicide label this way, I'm not really sure. No recommendation on hack and squirt, but 100% spray to wet the entire girdle. Banville or Vanquish, dicamba, the active ingredient there, you will find a very general statement on their herbicide labels regarding the use of dicamba. 25 to 50% spray mixture, basically spraying to wet the entire cuts. And then Clearcast or Mazamox, very limited use in hack and squirt, but very effective on Chinese tallow tree. But the label's unclear, and it basically says up to 100% in terms of injection, hack and squirt, or frill or girdle type treatments. If I'm using Clearcast for Chinese tallow tree, I'm making a pretty continuous series of cuts around the circumference with a 50 to 100% solution for control. Now, one major reality with all these herbicides is that a herbicide label does not always list every woody species it will control with a given invasive plant treatment technique. Perfect example of this is the Garlon 3A label. So this is directly from page 4 of the label. Plants controlled, the woody plant species listed here are what's on the label. However, Garlon 3A is used for so many more than this. Right here I have circled what we might call invasive plants: Australian pine, Brazilian pepper, kudzu, salt cedar, and Scotch broom. For the most part, as exotic plants that have invaded here in the U.S. and cause a lot of problems. However, we recommend Garlon 3A for a wide range of invasive plants. The company has just never taken the time to put them on the label. There may be reasons for that in some cases. I don't have a very clear explanation. But again, this goes back to the reality of Garlon 3A being developed as a forestry type herbicide that we in the invasive plant world grabbed a hold of because we found it could be effective. And you will see this exact same issue for all the other herbicides, for imazapyr, for glyphosate, for aminopyrrolate, and so forth. There will be a limited number of invasives on a lot of those labels regarding control. So where do you go to get good efficacy information? A lot of publications out there nationwide, and I can't list them all here. Cooperative Extension Service has a tremendous number of within-state publications, and then the USDA Forest Service has a lot of publications regarding hack and squirt. You have to search for these things sometimes, and you'll find them under the headings of brush control, under forestry, silviculture operations, selective hardwood thinning, and then of course invasive plants as another search term there. But you'll find typically in most states publications that do describe these techniques and often will provide some recommendations on invasive plants that they are effective on. A more regional guide for the southeastern U.S., a management guide for invasive plants in southern forests, written by myself and my colleagues Jim Miller and Steve Manning, that provides a large number of recommendations for invasive woody plants in the southeastern U.S. There's also, and here's a good example of one of the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station general technical reports, not dealing with invasives per se, but just dealing with the general technical aspects of doing individual plant treatments for basically managing vegetation. And so there's hack and squirt and treatments are included within that publication. Go to invasive.org and you can see the Nature Conservancy's old page from the Nature Conservancy Global Invasive Species team. Has a tremendous amount of historic and archived information there and recommendations on invasive plant management, hack and squirt being a technique widely utilized in their weed control methods handbook. So great place to go back and dig up a lot of older information. In addition, we have other databases like the Midwest Invasive Plant Network's Invasive Plant Control Database that you can search by species and come up with specific recommendations for a number of different techniques, including hack and squirt type treatments. For the Western U.S., Jody Tomaso and company put together a very nice publication for invasive plant management in the Western U.S. I don't have a picture of that one here. But among these limited publications, I've tried to provide some coverage across the country for specific recommendations. The herbicides that people are using most often, again, back to my survey from the Southeast, you'll see that glyphosate, imazapyr, and triclopyr alone are widely utilized. Combinations of those on a little bit more limited basis, but a lot of folks will put them together. Very limited, no use of aminopyrrolate and aminocyclopyrrolate at this point. And other would be basically picloram, dicamba, or imazamox. So we've gone to all this work. How long does it take for hack and squirt or girdling to kill a tree? Now, this is where I strongly recommend patience, patience, patience. Leaf drop may occur from only a few weeks to a few months after treatment. It takes time. And if you do it in the fall, you may never even notice it as the trees go through natural senescence. If you do it during the growing season, you'll definitely see it happen. However, the dropping of those leaves does not indicate the tree is dead. Complete mortality of the target can often take 1 to 2 growing seasons after treatment for complete kill there. So if you're expecting this to use this technique and kill the trees within a couple of weeks or months, you're going to have to be more patient than that. If you see aggressive basal sprouting or epicormic sprouting that appears very healthy, that does not have any herbicide symptomology on it, that can begin to signify treatment failure or that treatment kill was incomplete. So you may wipe out the target main stems, but you may have some resprouting at the base. And that has historically been a problem both with native hardwoods and forestry operations, and it is definitely a problem with many woody invasives. Now, someone asked me the question, can I integrate hack and squirt with basal bark treatment? So utilizing hack and squirt along with applying triclopyr ester herbicide or possibly a imazapyr in an oil carrier around the base of the trees. And my first question is, well, why would you want to do that? It's an extra step. Typically, we're trying to go as fast as we can in terms of individual plant treatments, and so to sort of double up and do both techniques on the same tree seems like a lot of extra work. Well, the reality is sometimes, yes, you can do it, and sometimes it can be helpful. We like to push the limits of basal bark treatment, treating things that are greater than 6 inches in diameter at breast height, or these multi-stem things like this, like Brazilian pepper tree in South Florida. And oftentimes on these older, very mature, very well established, larger individuals, folks will take and do a few hacks around the base of this in kind of a frill type fashion that basically just peels back the bark. That they then follow that up with the typical basal bark application that can be applied. Any species that have very thick bark at a younger age, sometimes that can be useful in terms of getting more effective control. However, I've also seen the technique fail in a lot of cases where folks were taking and hacking extremely large trees and trying to use only basal bark treatment. So yes, it can work. Applicators attacking multi-stem shrubs with large root collar diameters can make a series of hacks just prior to basal treatment and get more effective control. Additionally, for extremely large trees like Casuarina or Australian pine, oftentimes applicators will attack the trees by taking a chainsaw. Forgive me, the text is wrong there, but basically taking a chainsaw and girdling the tree and applying a 20 to 25% solution of Garland-4 oil directly into that girdle all the way around the tree. That is really effective for some trees like Casuarina, others not so good. So it really depends upon the species, and it may or may not be helpful. We're still working on exactly how to do hack and squirt in situations like this. With invasives, we often find a lot of crazy growth forms. And so this is a big mess, but it is a reality that applicators face sometimes, and we need to know how to kill these types of things. There's a lot of research that needs to be done. Okay. Moving on to herbicide flashback. All right, so this is a quiz I gave to the 2 conferences from Florida and Southeast EPSI, and basically said when using hack and squirt type methodologies, herbicide flashback occurs frequently, rarely, never, or what is flashback? And the respondents basically indicated they didn't really know what flashback was for the most part. So flashback is something you really need to know about, especially regarding the types of selective treatments we are often applying for invasive plant control. I'll give you the definitions of herbicide flashback. There's a few components. Number 1, the passive loss of herbicide from roots following treatment, and that can result in unintended injury to adjacent vegetation. So as we kill a tree with hack and squirt, the herbicide is translocated into the roots during that process. The roots die, they begin to break down. The herbicide is actually released into the soil where it is then picked up by the roots of another adjacent tree. So that we often see within that flashback symptomology of yellowing, a flash of yellowing oftentimes that may be temporary, or it could be complete or major injury. So here it is, loss of herbicide from dead or dying roots. The herbicide becomes available in the soil solution, which is then absorbed by nearby trees of any species. The second component of the definition is when an untreated tree near a treated tree exhibits herbicide damage symptoms or dies due to herbicide transfer through root grafting. So what I mean by that is when 2 different individuals' roots grow together and actually form a graft where their vascular tissues may or may not be connected. So this would be an example of that. You have 2 side-by-side trees. The roots are growing in very close proximity. Some of those roots have actually grafted with each other, and the herbicide is actually transferred through the vascular tissue from one tree to the other through that graft. Now, some notes on root grafting, because we blame it a lot of times, and when we shouldn't be blaming it. It's typically intraspecific, meaning it's between individuals of the same species, which is widespread in angiosperms and gymnosperms. So root grafting does occur between individuals of the same species very frequently. It's very common in both natural and modified environments, such as urban situations, orchards, nurseries, and plantations. Interspecific, so root grafting between individuals of different species, basically even for closely related species it's uncommon, and for non-related species or distantly related species it is extremely rare. So rarely do we have root grafting to blame when we are killing say Chinese tallow tree and a live oak next door manifest some herbicide damage through flashback. That's typically going to be from release of the herbicide, from dying roots, or I'm going to give you a third definition here, which I think is very important for hack and squirt. And that is when an untreated tree near a treated tree exhibits herbicide symptoms or dies due to herbicide transfer through runoff and uptake from the soil. Take a look at these nice hacks here. So basically I used a ZEP bottle, which means I was putting up almost 3 mils of herbicide solution per squirt. And what you see is this massive amount of material that is running out of these hacks. And this, for soil residual materials, herbicides, that can actually be a significant amount of herbicide being put directly into the soil around the base of that tree. So as that tree begins to die and other roots opportunistically grow into that space, there's a lot of herbicide available right there in the soil solution, at least for a short time. And I think this is where we often see a lot of our problems, especially when we're using imazapyr. Now we know imazapyr is exuded through the roots that are dying, but I do believe that this is a very important thing you should pay attention to. So it's very important in my mind to keep the herbicide in the cuts for a more precise type application. Here's a good example of a hack of sweet gum, and here we've got some nearby shrubs. So we got some curling on the tips there. You look closely here, a good example of some flashback we saw. These are not root grafted together, but there is a very strong chance that that was soil residual activity from an auxin type herbicide that I put out there. Okay, a quick demonstration of how to demonstrate herbicide translocation through hack and squirt. This is really easy to do, and I strongly recommend you do this. Go out any time of the year, but you might do it seasonally to see the difference. Take a spray indicator, make a hack, put that concentrate spray indicator directly into that hack and wait 15 to 30 minutes. Wait a couple hours if you want to, but wait just a little while and come back and start peeling the bark away. So what you can see is my hack right here. So I peeled the bark away higher up on the tree, and what you can see is the spray indicator is very clear in the tissue there. So we can see upward flow of the herbicide. Often you'll see that very strongly in the spring. And here's an example, here's the hack, and here's an example of downward flow of the herbicide. So this is really cool, and it gets people excited who haven't seen this before to demonstrate exactly how well that herbicide is moving, either upwards or downwards. And you have to do this in the fall, and you will often see that herbicide moving extremely fast downwards as we're getting a lot of photosynthetes move down to the roots. Do it with a girdle treatment. Again, you can see the same thing there. And you can see with the downward movement of the herbicide following the treatment. So, along with all of these how-to statements, I've got just a few do-not statements I'd like to share with you. Number one, do not use hack and squirt where dead standing trees are unsafe. I mentioned that the first of the seminar. I want to end with it. I can't reiterate how important it is. So public parks with a lot of pedestrian traffic, not a good place for treating large trees. Do not make cuts directly above or below other cuts. It's very easy to mess up when doing hack and squirt. You do the best you can, but one thing never to do is making a series of cuts directly above or below other cuts, because you will hinder translocation greatly in doing so. And finally, do not lose patience. Allow the treatment time to work. You should see, in the growing season, you should see a lot of leaf drop and discoloration within a couple of months. If you treat in the fall, you probably will not see a lot of leaf out the next spring, but give them 1 to 2 growing seasons most of the time to do their thing. Do not get excited and go in and cut them down in too short a time period after doing hack and squirt. It sort of defeats the whole purpose of that. If you're going to cut the tree down anyway, go ahead and do a cut stump treatment. Okay, so with that, I think I'm going to stop right there, and I will be happy to take any and all questions. I suspect there's probably a lot of species-specific questions. Being a national webinar, it was just kind of impossible to cover species nationwide, but I'll be happy to answer questions as best I can from here. All right, Karen,
All
go
right.
for it.
Thank you, Stephen. That was great. We have the first question from Barry Bingham, and they have a walnut farm in Middle Tennessee. And he said they've had good success with the half-inch drill using 3 holes per tree for hawthorn tree control using 50% Roundup. And he's asking about any thoughts on killing poison ivy vines and Virginia creeper climbing the walnuts. They spray with Roundup, he says.
Okay, so you got to be careful with poison ivy. On those really large poison ivy vines, so if they are established in over 1 inch in diameter, you can actually use hack and squirt on those, making a hack into the side of the vine. And I'd probably be injecting at least a 50% solution of glyphosate, or squirting a 50% solution of glyphosate into those hacks. You can also cut stump them. So if you can take pruning shears and cut the poison ivy vine away from the tree and treat the entire sort of stump top, that's another very effective way to go after it. Glyphosate is the safest thing to use in those cases for established walnut trees with thick bark. Be very careful about spraying glyphosate on any younger walnut trees that have green bark on them, or you can see some serious injury.
Okay, and the second part of Barry's question is they've got about 6 acres of 30-year-old cedar trees that they're wanting to get rid of in the most efficient manner. What would be the best way with hack and squirt method?
You know, my first inclination would be to take a chainsaw and just cut them down. You're not going to see any resprouting from eastern red cedar.
Yeah, he mentions a bulldozer.
Okay, well, if you can do that too, that's going to be a lot more disturbance than just to run that dozer across the landscape. But if you could chainsaw them, you wouldn't even need an herbicide because they do not resprout.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, it's jumping around here. And
How many
someone
questions do you
mentioned
have, by the way?
that on the camelback, that would actually be illegal to use in some areas. So just advising everyone to double check regulations in your state or county before using that particular product
Yeah,
to carry a pesticide in.
yeah, absolutely. Let me follow up on that. I wasn't trying to show that to say everyone needs to go and do that. I showed that picture merely to indicate people are trying to be creative in finding novel ways to carry herbicide and dispense it with the hack and squirt methodology. So no, yeah, follow any local state regulations that you would have regarding the carrying of pesticides, especially in a drinking container like that. Sometimes I hesitate to show it, but in this case, it was merely to show you that that folks are trying to think outside the box in the way they're doing hack and squirt. I personally like the hard plastic 2-liter backpack better than using the types of soft bladders for carrying pesticides, just because they're a heck of a lot more durable and less subject to puncture.
And then Mark, no, let's see, hold on, I'm losing. Okay, Nathan Rayer asked how this affects northern U.S. species, and I'm guessing like time of year maybe. Wasn't any more specific than that.
Oh, okay.
The best time, I guess, in more northern area states to do the treatment.
Well, I would probably say late summer, early fall,
Okay.
before the leaves drop off. I think the further north you go, I think you're going to be better off hitting within that end of the growing season.
Okay. And then Mark Stadler asked if neighboring desirable trees can be harmed, and I think you've answered that already. Mark, if you want to expound on that question any, just type that into the question box. But I think Stephen's answered that. And
Yes, and I'll follow up right quickly on that again.
okay.
When you're doing selective hardwood thinning, yes, that's very common if you're trying to control one of the tree of the same species and another one is nearby to see that type of flashback. It's best to be careful. It's best to keep the herbicide in the hacks, especially if you're using a Mazapir or Picloram, or Aminopyrrole even for that matter.
Okay.
Okay.
And Jason Van Houten is asking, can you use Garlon 4 in oil for hack and squirt? This has often been used for basil bark, but no recommendations for hack and squirt on the label.
Yeah, isn't that funny, Jason? You go to all the triclopyr ester herbicide labels, Garlon 4, Garlon 4 Ultra, the generics, and you won't find hack and squirt on them as far as I can tell. Strongly recommended for all the basil type strategies, um, except the one idea which I suggested of doing basil bark applications, but also incorporating a few type frill cuts that sort of strip away the outer layer of thick, heavy bark. You're still doing a basil bark application in that case, so you're not selectively putting it into a cut. So that's about as close as I've seen come. So for the Garlon 4 or triclopyr ester formulations, I think we've found over time the amine formulation is just much more effective when delivering the herbicide directly into the cambium.
Okay. And, well, let's see, Jean-Marc Dufour, sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right, is asking about the multi-stem trees and the hack and squirt, which you partly answered already, and was asking specifically if you got any experience with wattles.
Okay, with wattles. Okay, so by wattles, I'm thinking you mean acacias
That's what I
type
would think.
trees. Yeah, okay. The first thing I would recommend there, we're having really good success utilizing milestone, aminopyrrole is the active ingredient there, on leguminous trees using hack and squirt. And I would say that you should definitely give it a shot. I've got some work just about starting to work on earleaf acacia in South Florida. Worked on lead tree, worked on mimosa, and milestone is very effective on the legumes, and I think that it would probably be very promising on wattles too.
Okay. And Patricia Greenberg is asking if herbicide flashback is more common in allelopathic species such as Ailanthus.
Okay, is it more common in allelopathic species? That is an excellent question. I have never been asked that before, and I do not have a straight answer for you on that, and I think we probably don't know, to tell you the truth. We can see flashback across a number of species. I've never seen any direct correlation regarding those species like Ailanthus that are more allelopathic. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you, but I think we just don't know.
Okay. Do you ever recommend a second treatment on the same individual, for example, in the second year, and that's ceraminic?
Okay, do I recommend a second treatment of hack and squirt? Typically, not necessarily. If you do it right the first time, you should not need to do a second hack and squirt treatment. Sometimes if you see some basil sprouting at that point, coming back with a foliar treatment to those basil sprouts is probably a little bit quicker and guaranteed to be more effective than a second hack and squirt. One thing you'll notice as a tree slowly begins to die following hack and squirt, where are you going to make the next hacks? So oftentimes you may see a lot of dead tissue, and if you're hacking into dead or dying tissue, you're not going to get good translocation at all.
Okay. Um, let's see. The next question is Jay Dorsey. The best way to eradicate hardy citrus, Ponceus trifoliata, trees that have already produced fruit.
Okay, Ponceus trifoliata. So honestly, hack and squirt is going to be a difficult treatment method to use for Ponceus because of those awful thorns and the degree of sprouts and basil sprouts that you get on those. In my experience, basil bark treatment, Garlon 4, 20% in oil, or cut it down, and you can even use Pathfinder, which is a little bit lower concentration of Garlon 4 as a basil bark treatment. Triclopyr ester. Bottom line is that has absolutely been a nuclear option for treating Ponceus. So basil bark with Garlon 4 or generic in oil or Pathfinder 2 ready to use has been extremely effective for killing Ponceus with no resprouting. That fruit issue, if they've already produced fruits, the fruits are there, there's viable seed there. Best thing you can do is I hate to say this, but keep cattle from eating them and spreading them around. or even deer for that matter too.
Okay. Barbara Thornhill is asking for the best way to treat Ailanthus.
The best way to treat Ailanthus, okay. That is an excellent question. So Ailanthus, tree of heaven, is a very aggressive re-sprouter from very long lateral roots. And this is one of those that you almost want to have a conversation because providing direct answers is often very difficult until I find out exactly what you have done. If imazapyr is a safe option, imazapyr is going to be very effective on tree of heaven. The triclopyr type treatments have also worked pretty well. Glyphosate I know has been much weaker on tree of heaven in a lot of cases. So that is my short answer for a much more complex issue, and I would welcome you to email me the specifics of your question there, and perhaps I can dialogue with you a little bit more by email on that.
Okay, thanks. The next question is from Leroy Rogers, and down in Florida. And intense and sudden thunderstorms are common in our area. Are there adjuvants that might increase rain fastness for hack and squirt applications?
Okay, excellent question, Leroy. If you look very closely on some of the imazapyr labels, they will say that sometimes it is recommended to include an adjuvant, excuse me, like a non-ionic surfactant when you're doing hack and squirt type applications. It's often in a situation where there's concern for rapid callus formation, or where the species is forming tylose plugs very quickly, that would limit the herbicide's translocation or direct access to that tissue. So you'll see that on the habitat label. In terms of a sticker, a spread, type adjuvant that you could add that would help you out, I don't see why it would be a problem. But in my experience, that's probably more of an issue for cut stumps than it is hack and squirt, because we typically see the material moving in very rapidly when doing hack and squirt. Now I understand, Leroy, the situation with very rapid dumps of rainfall. So adding one in certainly is not going to hurt things at all and can be of some benefit. There's not been much research done really that has examined herbicide washout of hack and squirt type cuts after application. So I'll have to talk to you about that later for sure by email.
Okay, and then I've got a couple more people have asked questions about various large vines, and they're mentioning specifically various invasive vines such as kudzu, English ivy, wisteria from Jill Swearingen, and then oriental bittersweet vines from Carol Gerns.
Yes, okay. So is it possible to do hack and squirt type operations on those? Oftentimes you can get literally one good hack on the side of the vine. And oftentimes if you can just cut the entire vine and do a cut stump on those larger vines, I think that's a better option in a lot of cases. Glyphosate, again, about a 50% solution is probably one of your safer options there. Any leguminous vines, the application of milestone as a 10% cut stump application is going to be extremely effective. So for kudzu, for wisteria, milestone directly applied as a cut stump, or if you can do it hack and squirt, is going to be very effective at a 10% solution. English ivy, that's another nasty one. The concentrated glyphosate is probably the better way to go for that one. I don't think milestone's going to work well at all. Triclopyr also should do a good job on that, so the triclopyr amine formulation.
Okay.
Cut surface, not foliar. Cut surface specifically.
Okay.
Okay.
So, in that, you think that would work on vines up to a foot in diameter? Even would be better to do the cut stump?
If you can safely cut them, I think it is, because hack and squirt for a vine growing up the side of a tree, you're going to be limited in the hacking around the circumference of that vine, and where that's not going to be a limitation if you can actually just cut it.
Okay. And is hack and squirt a good treatment for Chinese privet, or would you recommend a different approach?
Excellent question. So Chinese privet, which I worked a lot on during the last 7 years in Alabama at Auburn University, one of the problems with hack and squirt for Chinese privet as a multi-stem shrub that's often branching very low, very difficult to hack all those stems. If you were able to successfully hack the circumference just above the soil level, I think you'd do a really good job with either glyphosate or triclopiramine, but you're going to be crawling around literally on your hands and knees trying to make clean cuts with very limited swing room. So that's going to be very difficult. Where you're in a situation that you don't have a lot of those old multi-stemmed trees and where you've actually got a lot of those 2 to 4 inch diameter that don't have multi-stems or single stemmed, in that case hack and squirt with glyphosate would probably work pretty well. So it's definitely worth a shot.
Let's see, and that was Ryan Mallory asking that question. Ron Hauser is asking, how can the average homeowner control Chinese tallow using hack and squirt or cut stump if they do not have access to commercial herbicides?
Okay, excellent question. And tallow tree is one of those awful things. One thing I recommend for homeowners going after tallow tree, if you go to one of the box stores, you're going to find 2 options of glyphosate, which you can get concentrated glyphosate. So you can get Roundup Pro and a few other Roundups that are above 41% active ingredient up to about 55%. So you can get a concentrated glyphosate product. Your triclopiramine products are not going to be very effective because in the box stores the only thing they have will be about an 8.8% solution. Now you can order things like you can order a lot of herbicides online, or you can go to some feed and seed stores which will have an expanded selection, so that you can get things like Pathfinder 2 for basal bark application on Chinese tallow tree, which is pretty effective on anything less than about 6 inches in diameter. So that's a possibility that you can utilize. Homeowners probably should never be using imazapyr just because there's way too much chance to get in trouble, and it is not labeled in any home landscapes. So glyphosate is the easiest thing. Cut stumps, 50%, immediately treat that. You can cut a little bit higher stump, maybe about 4 to 6 inches, and if you see resprouting the next year, cut the stump lower. If the tissue's still green, treat that sucker again. I know that's a slower process, but sometimes for homeowners it may be the best thing you can do.
Okay. And then you addressed exactly what he was asking about. He specified in another statement that herbicides that are available generally to homeowners as opposed to professionals.
Okay.
And Bob Ball wants to know, why use hack and squirt if girdling works well? What would be the reason for using one over the other?
Great question. So if girdling alone is working for you, then you don't need any chemicals. Go for it. The problem with most invasives is they typically resprout pretty strongly from the root collar region or from shallow lateral roots. And in those cases, girdling alone typically just results in a massive release of woody stems from the base of those trees, and a lot of those will thin out, but enough of them will survive that you'll actually increase your stem density and you'll have a bigger mess that's even more difficult to deal with. So if you're dealing with species that don't resprout, by all means girdle away. I'm happy for you. Just the invasive world, a lot of things do resprout pretty strongly.
Tim Stallard in Alaska is just offering the comment that they had better luck using a pruning saw to penetrate the bark of invasive European bird cherry, Prunus patus, and they were getting a lot of glancing blows even with the sharp hatchet, he says.
Okay, so so cherry. So the Prunus species can be pretty darn hard, and what you're doing there is probably a little bit safer, utilizing a saw to saw down into it. I did not cover the use of saws for hack and squirt because it's often done on a very limited basis, and it often takes a whole lot longer in my experience, to run a saw than it is to take a hatchet or a machete. But that's very good to point out that there are some hardwoods out there that are extremely hard, dense wood that a hatchet just may not even cut it. Good point.
And that's all the questions that we've got at this point. And we'd like to say thank you to everyone for attending the webinar. And again, Stephen's email address is here, and be sure to copy that down if you want to ask another question or get some more details on a question that you've asked. And this entire presentation will be available online by the end of the week, possibly sooner, but definitely by the end of the week. And Barry is saying thank you for your time and knowledge, Stephen.
Oh, well, thank you. I have thoroughly enjoyed this, and happy NISAW week this week, and happy Hack and Squirt.
And you're getting thank yous from many of the attendees. Thanks everyone for attending.
Excellent. You're very welcome. Everyone have a good day.